our first session for the day, Making India Work. Please join me once again in welcoming Shashi Tharoor, Jayanthi Natarajan, A.S. Dulat, T.N. Ninan, and N. Ram.
Our panel doesn't need an introduction. They then go on to say quite a few words on each of them, but in this case, the brochure is available. I think many you know who the panelists are, and I won't bother to take up time to introduce them. Making India Work. This is a very open-ended subject. You could look at it from many angles because we are extremely complex. But we had a little bit of a discussion and thought a few issues would come up. This is going to be quite an open and free-ranging conversation. You have people who have been very articulate on the idea of India, politicians, on pluralism, on secularism, on communalism, and so on. You have a very distinguished editor who's specialized in business journalism, written books on the economy and what needs to be done, and you have one of the leading practitioners and thinkers on security issues here. So some of those issues may crop up, but I'm going to start with a sort of literary overture. This famous contestation of Naipaul, V.S. Naipaul, of something that R.K. Narayan told him in the 50s when they had a conversation in London. Naipaul reports that he was much struck by R.K. Narayan's assertion, I don't know what the conversation was about, that, quote, India will go on. It could be quite a profound statement with implications because that was a difficult time, many problems besieging India, fairly newly independent at that time. But here was a writer, a senior writer, older than Naipaul, much older than Naipaul, who told him that whatever may be, India will go on, which struck Naipaul as a very profound statement. He wrote about it. Later on, in India, A Wounded Civilization, which came out in 1977, and was much influenced by Naipaul's experience, observation of what is happening during the emergency, Naipaul came up after that in this book with a revisionist critique of this attitude. You can read it yourself, where he thought that this was a peculiar Hindu view of approaching problems like mass poverty, or he thought overpopulation, the dirty cities, and rural India, and so on. Naipaul was horrified by what he saw. But don't forget that that was under the impress of the emergency, a very unusual event. So there's much discussion on this, and you could take a stance that India will go on no matter what. That's not what R.K. Narayan meant in this statement. Naipaul, by the way, was a great admirer of his writing. So those issues, the issue is met in the literary space. So I'm going to start by asking T.N. Ninan, maybe to start this conversation. What's going right and what's going wrong if we take this on, making India work? You have Make in India, you have, and so on. So, do you really think we have the components in place, the various items in place to make India work the way we want, the way you want?
Thank you, Ram, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. That's a big question. If I can try and quickly encapsulate what I think. One is that India is working better than before. And it has been getting progressively better. India will go on, but it won't be the same India. It will be a changing India. And I think the primary issue, if we want to look at what needs to be improved, is that India works essentially for roughly the top 40% of the population. That's the market economy. And it doesn't really work for the bottom 60%. Some of that bottom 60%, about half of it, are at the fringes of it, and I think the bottom 30% are not. Now, that is not a satisfactory situation, particularly after 7 decades of independence. And I think if one wants to change that, the key issue to me is the lack of state capacity. And building on to that lack of state capacity, the state trying to do too many things in too many ways. And basically that mismatch is what causes a whole series of problems. Now, I can expand on that.
What about political will? We often hear that you lack, this government or that government lacks the political will to make a real dent on mass deprivation, which is what we are talking about.
You know, there are two political practitioners here, so they may answer what is political will. But the way I see it is that you have to create the conditions in which politicians make rational choices. And a fundamental bridge that our political class has not crossed is the belief that functioning markets are as much a public good as clean air and water supply and so on. The constant desire to interfere with markets and create distortions, which then create room for all kinds of stuff to go on, that instinct remains with us, and you see it even today all the time. The inability to recognize that markets are an essential institution that you need to nurture.
Mr. Dual, you are said to be well known for your social skills. I'm quoting from this brochure. Dual prefers dialogue to clandestine maneuvers. Dulat, sorry. Dulat, I'm sorry.
Dual is a much bigger man, sir. I'm only a joker in this pack.
Sorry, forget. Dulat prefers dialogue to clandestine operations. Do you have any views on what we just heard?
Yeah, I'm not an economist, but even Mr. Ninan has admitted that India is a tortoise. Now, this is what I have an issue with, because, when Modi ji came to power in 2014, there was great euphoria. And we were told that better days lay ahead and that, there would be great development. There'd be wonders or miracles in the economy. Now we are told that the economy is not a sprint, but a marathon, and everything takes time. The problem I have is that there are too many parallel marathons happening at the same time. And then it gives you the impression that we are marking time or double marking time, and which brings one to the status quo, that you remain where you were. And that's what the bureaucracy loves and thrives on. And then gradually sells to politicians, and they follow it. And anybody who falls out of line is ridiculed, like our chief minister in Delhi. They refer to him as an idiot. Somebody says he's an international menace. But I see a spark in Kejriwal. I see the making of a politician in Kejriwal. Now I'll tell you something. I was very tickled the other day, but also hugely impressed with the huge turnout and rally that he had in the Punjab. And what was he wearing? A yellow turban which came straight out of Patiala. And then I read that he's learning Punjabi. So Vaheguru Ji da Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji di Fateh, he is on the right track. He is making an impact, and he's going to be a big player in the Punjab next year, because people want change. That's what Bihar demonstrated. That's what Delhi has demonstrated. And that's, I think, what Punjab is going to demonstrate.
Jayanthi, if we could stay with this subject, taking in what he said, surprising thing, Mr. Dulat, what you say, because you are a deep insider. You're not supposed to be photographed. when you were in power. You did things we know little about, nothing about. And if you say this, it carries fresh meaning for all of us. Jayanthi, we want to come in.
Yes, Mr. Ninan started by saying India is working. Yes, I think one of the greatest things we need to be very, very proud about is the areas in which India is working, has always worked, has never let us down, which is our constitution, which we continue to insist is a secular, socialist constitution, which means that the last citizen in the state, the most disadvantaged citizen in the country, should get his or her right benefits. So the constitution works, universal franchise works. Many would say that, separation of powers and the judiciary, the iron frame of the bureaucracy. Politicians, I'm assuming that everybody, all of you are going to say don't work. So I'm not getting into that slippery slope at all. But I have a lot to say about the judiciary, which I'll come to in a minute. But two main issues where it's not working. And I'm extremely wary of Mr. Ninan's theory about the market, because I believe that this famous trickle-down effect of the economy, especially in a country like India, where we don't have a social security net officially, apart from all the schemes that I'll come to in 1 second, the trickle-down effect where the effect of a growing market will trickle down to the last citizen has not worked and may not work for this reason. Democracy is not just about economic growth. Democracy is about mass deprivation, about removal of poverty. And the problem is, maybe in the USA there are 5% poor people. In India, there are a vast number more. They say 22%. But they don't have the power to leverage policy making at any major level. And the reason I believe they don't have the power to leverage policy making is because of an ethnic divide. People tend to also vote along caste lines. So they somehow fail to influence policy, which is why most politicians, most governments would tend to go for the direct subsidy transfer, rural job guarantee, transfer of cash subsidies, so that, because that's what a politician would do, a government would do. It works immediately and it works effectively. The second quick point that I want to make, Ram, is that women and youth, we keep on proudly talking. Everybody talks about the demographic dividend. We are so proud that 64% of our population, will be young and in the workforce. But that's 800 million young people, roughly. 800 million knocks on the ceiling of employment, of health. 800 million demands. And I'm afraid we don't have, it's a very flimsy scaffold that we have to fulfill those demands. And if you take women, they say 33% of women are in the workforce, 33% of half of India. And unless you might call it empowerment, but when those women come out in public, a man getting a job is a sign of a healthy economy. A woman getting a job is a far more complex issue in the sense of a patriarchy allowing the woman to work, giving her the access to education, letting her come out into the public space. And the famous case of Nirbhaya, where even when she gets into that public space, she's educated, she's qualified, the patriarchy has let her work. People who are challenged by this woman who's out in a public space at a supposedly odd time feel that it's right to rape her and kill her. So this is the India we are living in today, and it's definitely not working. I think we need to, no government, no people, no polity that doesn't address it is going to be able to convince our people here that India doesn't work. Of course, the question of Delhi being far away and states having issues are something that we can talk about later.
Now, when it comes to mass deprivation and what Ninan said, I just want to speak up for him that, because I've known him from the time he was here.
I'd like to respond if I can.
You will, but you may not have to after you hear what I say. I've never known Ninan, while speaking to the market, not focus on the need to address directly this issue of mass deprivation, the 60% that he referred to. So I preempted you and saved some time. Shashi. If you can speak to this subject, what he raised.
Yeah, well, I'd say that India is working at the sort of macro level and not working at the micro. I mean, if you look at the big picture, everyone is right. Ninan made the point that this is not the sort of timeless, unchanging land of hoary cliche. It's a land that has changed dramatically in all respects. In politics, we've had a huge revolution. We've gone from a single-party system to an era of coalition governance. Now, again, there is a party with a majority. In economy, we've gone from a relatively closed, protected economy where self-reliance was the mantra to the post-liberalization period after 1991. In social relations, extraordinary transformations of caste. I mean, who could have imagined for 3,000 years a Dalit woman ruling the land of Aryavrata? And there Mayawati has been Chief Minister of UP 3 times and perhaps poised to come back again. So you're looking at enormous transformations that in many other societies could only have occurred through a violent revolution. And in India, these transformations have occurred through a democratic process of change and evolution, which I think shows that fundamentally India is working. Now, when you get down to, is India working in, thank you. But when you get down to, is India working in the nuts and bolts of the situation today, the comments with which our moderator began his questioning, I would say probably not, because you have the slogans you mentioned, the Make in India and the Startup India and the Don't Stop India and God knows what else.
Smart cities.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I wish we had cities that basically worked before we worried about how smart they were. But the fact is that some things are simply not working. We're getting excellent speeches and slogans, but we have a prime minister who's like a doctor who can make a diagnosis, but apparently can't deliver the medicines. I can give you example after example, and please don't blame the opposition in Parliament, because not everything requires Parliament. He made a speech shortly after becoming Prime Minister at the opening of some sort of shopping complex or whatever, where he said it's a shame that in India it takes 200 steps to open a store, and in the US he said it takes 6, which I don't know if those numbers are accurate, but that's what he said. Well, 18 months later, it still takes 200 steps to open a store because nobody in his government has sat down to rewrite the regulations that impede businesses' ability to open that store. So how do things work? At the moment, what happens is that every ministry works very long hours and is anxious to demonstrate that all the secretaries are well at work in late hours of the evening and are not going off to play golf. But then, having done their work, the files go to the PMO where they sit in a Bermuda Triangle. And no one can find a file, no decisions are made. The most basic, simple decisions are not being made, as a result of which you have a sense of paralysis in government, which obviously is incompatible with the notion of making India work. Finally, there was this comment about political will, and I think we're seeing much more of the political won't, and perhaps the political can't. But the truth is that politics in a democracy is the only effective way in which you can deliver major change. But it requires dialogue, it requires reaching out to the opposition, it requires some consensus building. Ultimately, everybody's interested in seeing India thrive and prosper. And I think what is lacking here at the moment is that sense of shared purpose, which has in the past always managed to animate our system, and perhaps that's the breakdown we all need to worry about as well in the way things are going in our politics.
If we may go back to some concrete things now, taking off from what you observed, where you started, some basic things. Now look at nutrition. We talk about the decline of poverty, some figures are given and so on. But if you look at the picture of nutrition across the country, and the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation has, of which I'm a trustee, I disclose that, has brought out a map, a nutritional map of India, pointing to the inadequacies. It's an appalling picture, particularly for children. Or look at the question. Look at this promise that you'll provide health for all. That's a slogan. The picture is appalling. Okay, some states do much better than others. Kerala, Tamil Nadu, etc. There is some kind of public health system. But looking at it, India is one of the minority of countries where people have to meet their health expenses. They're hugely out of pocket, something like 80%. These are the estimates of what people pay for health is not provided by society and the state. How do you address these issues? You could think of more.
Okay, make just two preparatory comments. One is in the context of what we are seeing and hearing in the last couple of years. And I read recently somebody quoting a Chinese proverb which translates into big thunder, few raindrops. So I think we're seeing big thunder and few raindrops at this moment. But to respond to what Jayanthi said, a market economy is not in conflict with social benefits. All developed market economies have major social benefits and social security programs. So that is not, it's not an either-or situation at all. The issue is whether you distort markets in order to create social benefits or you do it in a more efficient way. So just to put that aside.
Can you hear him? Yes, okay.
Oh, okay.
I have some doubts with the mic.
Okay. Now, sorry, what is the question?
Nutrition.
Nutrition, yes, that's right, sorry. These are fundamental questions, and it comes back to what I said about state capacity and the state diverting its attention to putting 20,000 crores into financing Air India and planning to put another 20,000 crores to finance Air India, whereas you should be focusing on exactly the issues that you raised. So the state frittering its energies and resources in non-essential areas and not focusing on the essentials. And the strange thing is that in all political systems across East Asia, we've seen people deliver the basics. You've seen it in a Chinese communist system, we've seen it in a dictatorship that South Korea had, we've seen it under American rule in Japan, we've seen it across Southeast Asia. All of them transformed their literacy levels in a matter of 20 years. And 70 years later, we are 30 years behind China on our literacy levels. So this is an abominable situation. If you look at the Millennium Development Goals, we've made enormous progress, so I wouldn't deny that we have made progress. There is enormous progress. I would basically rate it at about B+, but Bangladesh, which is a much poorer country, has done much better. So I would think that the essential issue that the state has to focus on are these essentials. And that is the primary restraint on our system today.
No, I totally agree with Ninan that this is not a criticism of the market economy. The point is, hasn't trickled down. So we need all hands on board, so to speak. How do you make it, what is the point of a democracy where 22% don't have access to basic amenities? What kind of democracy is that? We need to address what kind of mixture we need. He talked about China and all the other economies that have made it work. Our children, I think, are in school for 4.4 years average, whereas in China it's 10 years, roughly.
India's 5.5, China's 7.6.
Right, so 5.5 and 7.6. So, and then we have maximum stunting, we have maximum malnourishment. This is not a scaffold on which to build that demographic dividend. Anyway, my point, Ram, what I wanted to come in was that I think we need to plan. And when I say plan, whether it's the Planning Commission, which I personally had massive run-ins with at that time, and whether it is today's Niti Aayog or whatever it is, we need to plan for what we have. For example, I know there are doctors in the audience, when we were talking about various illnesses, there are apparently 9,000 billing procedures for various ailments, procedures, operations, surgeries in the health sector, not even one procedure or unit for patient aftercare, follow-up or anything. So that adherence to protocols, to carry something through the implementation simply doesn't exist. The second example is NABARD, I think, several years ago, came out with a paper where they found which were the fields of greatest demand for employment. And surprisingly, it turned out to be, NABARD's paper said, bread making had the greatest number of employees that they needed. And yet we continue to churn out engineers. Whereas we don't have at all as many doctors and nurses as we need for the population. The ratio doctor-nurse to the population is absolutely woeful. So we need to plan. What are the resources we have? How do we set this out? How do we plan it? And bring the states in so that they can tell us what they need to do as well.
Shashi, so far we've had a fairly agreeable conversation. Now I'm going to ask you slightly not an inquisition, but a critical point. Your party has been in power for most of our independent career. Oh, 1 minute, you haven't heard the question. You haven't heard the question.
And I wasn't in it for most of that time, so Jayanthi was. Go on.
So, while I think it's a great time to be in the opposition right now,
Yeah.
right?
Totally.
No. The question is, the indictment is, you, meaning the party in government, have signally failed to deliver on Jawaharlal Nehru's promise, tryst with destiny. And if you break it, what did he say? Those basic needs. So you have to bear a huge share of this blame for where we are when we talk about not, making India work.
Sure.
I don't want to get you into further trouble.
No, you're welcome.
Twitter, your tweets.
You're welcome, but let me just clarify two things. Yes, we haven't gone as far as we should have, but no, we have actually made far more progress than most of us Indians credit our system with having accomplished. Take literacy. They're absolutely right to criticize the fact that we are still only at 74% literacy and it's only 65% for women. But when we got independence, we were at 17% literacy and only 8% of Indian women could read and write. That's where the British left us. And given that, yes, ideally we could have, Sri Lanka went faster than us, but they're a smaller place. Some parts of India did go faster. So Kerala has a higher rate of literacy than the United States. Bihar doesn't. Now, you can talk about variations in development in our country, but whenever people come up with averages for India, you have to take into account the enormous variations. Secondly, the Congress party has always believed that whether you grow at 9% or 7% or 10%, what really matters is the bottom 25% of your society. And that belief has translated into, as Ninan has implied rightly, a situation where you both privilege growth and you ensure that the fruits and revenues of that growth are distributed to the weakest and most marginalized sections of your society. Because the magic of the market cannot appeal to those who can't afford to enter the marketplace. And that is something which we have to worry about. I share Ninan's concern about market distortions, but I would agree that we do need to ensure who the ultimate beneficiaries are of our policies. And then finally, Ram, the thing is, the old joke in our country is that the economy grows at night when the government is asleep. Neither crediting nor blaming the government for everything is entirely wise. Some things have actually happened. It's an absolute recorded fact that for each of the last 10 years, 12 years now, but certainly the 10 years of UPA I can speak about with confidence, we managed to pull about 1% of our population, sometimes slightly more, sometimes slightly less, but about 10 million people a year out from below the poverty line every year. Now that's no small accomplishment. The only country in the world that has done better is China. And China has a system which, frankly, we cannot and should not want to replicate. In China, you want to build a 6-lane expressway, you can draw a line on a map and bulldoze every village and town in the path, and no one can stop you. In India, you want to widen a 2-lane road, particularly in my home state, you will be facing resistance from landowners, objections to the level of compensation being paid, fellows with red flags will be holding dharnas, movie stars will come down and fast for you. As the line goes, we are like this only. And we are not going to be able to change that quickly. But within our system, we have made progress. I refuse to give up hope. I think we are a lot better off than in my own childhood what I've seen around India. I believe progress has been made. This progress has been across all areas. I've seen the transformations in social relations. If you read a chapter on caste in India from midnight to the millennium, where I've written it in the form of a narrative, of a story, I've seen changes that in many ways would have been thought unthinkable by several generations before that. We've seen dramatic change in India since independence. Let's not knock it.
Ram, but
I want to just... Before that, Amarjit Saab, what is your take on this? I've suddenly become Saab, sir. But since you expect me to somewhere focus on security. And I could talk on terrorism, and I can talk about Pathankot in Mumbai. But since I have this Kashmir obsession, and that's where we faced the maximum violence in the last 25 years or so, let me start with Kashmir. I think it was the late Mufti Muhammad Saeed who once remarked that all a Prime Minister needs to do is engage with and make peace with Pakistan and focus on Kashmir. And Mufti Saab spent the whole of 2015 pleading for engagement with Pakistan. And when Modi ji finally went for that birthday party to Lahore, poor Mufti was in the ICU. And now it appears the state government is still in the ICU. So that is what is happening in Kashmir. And his daughter is playing hardball. So no one knows which way it's going to be. The BJP made the PDP wait for 2 months last year. I think now Mehbooba is going to make them, if not sweat, wait a while.
Thank you, Jayanthi.
And
yeah, sorry, go on.
Yeah, coming to Pakistan, just a comment.
If we can save that for a little later.
It was connected anyway.
We will come to that.
No, I was actually totally admiring and agreeing with what Shashi said, but taking advantage of the fact that I'm not in Parliament now, and being an absolutely passionate, emotional Chennaiite, I want to know, Shashi, why nobody in Parliament except the Tamilian MPs bothered, discussed, acknowledged that millions of Chennaiites were flooding, were living in abject terror, were dying in Parliament. Nobody even, I was outraged. I was outraged. I was watching, this is the place where I've spent longer than you have at this point of time. You'll probably spend longer than I have very shortly.
I'm not
but
sure I'm going to
I
try
was
to.
outraged. I was watching every session, you know, you were getting it adjourned. Somebody was not allowed into a temple. Somebody said something about something else. And here people were swimming, people were drowning, dead bodies were floating. Doesn't anybody care what happens south of the Vindhyas?
Jayanthi, I think on this one, you know how the system works. Yes, broadly speaking, you're concerned that what happens in the vicinity of Delhi and northern India always seems to rank higher in people's priorities, and the south and the northeast seem to be distant. That's not entirely untrue. That is a factor. But in fact, many of us gave notices on what is happening in Chennai. It was simply that the speaker, in picking and choosing amongst them, clearly favored the representatives from that state, which is the tradition in the House, because the idea is that people who've come from Tamil Nadu also have a political obligation to be seen as speaking on this. So they got the floor and we didn't. I actually, on one occasion, got my notice accepted, except that my party had chosen to disrupt at that time, and therefore I could not buck party discipline and speak. So such are the joys of our parliament.
Did you tweet about it and get into trouble?
No, in fact, but look, I mean, the truth is that as far as disruption is concerned, we had a brief discussion about this yesterday after my talk. The truth is that this is now the new golden rule in politics. You know, it is do unto others what they have done unto you. And so because the BJP has spent 10 years...
But Shashi, I think, may I request on my own behalf, just one sentence.
Let's not get into this issue.
Ram, just one sentence.
Parliament.
May I request that at times of natural disaster, that you recommend that Parliament makes an exception to disruption and talk about it so that people feel that people are with it. I mean, even when a TV anchor said it's not going to rain tomorrow, people were in tears. So Parliament should take notice.
No, I agree.
Okay, now moving on to another heavy issue, the question of the idea of India, which certainly is being contested. Sunil Khilnani wrote a very fine book about it. You have written on it. Various others have written. Nehru has written on it. Jawaharlal Nehru and various others.
The phrase is Tagore's, in fact. The phrase,
Tagore.
the idea of India is Tagore.
Tagore, yeah, okay. The idea that we are pluralistic, we are multi-everything. And unless you recognize and respect that and make that work on that basis, you're going to get into deep trouble. And it appears to me, as a journalist, that we have indeed got into deep trouble. We saw it coming in the late 80s. We saw it coming during the Car Seva agitation. Your party certainly, if you had an enemy like that, you didn't need friends towards the later part. That is how your party conducted itself in the mainstream media analysis. That's what paved the way. But today, we face a problem where the Sarchang Chalak of the RSS, Mohan Bhagwat, openly proclaims that India is a Hindu nation and respect that. Everyone has to respect that. And when you pin them down, they say, if not in a religious sense, at least in a cultural or civilizational sense. Now, you could quibble on that issue, but to me, it's clear that this challenges the basic structure of our constitution and the idea that, on secularism, and this was full-throatedly upheld by the Supreme Court of India in a 1994 judgment in the Bombay case. So, what do we do here? Can we make India work if we are so deeply divided on this basic question of what kind of country are you? I'm going to ask first Mr. Dulat to respond to this.
Yes, sir. Obviously we are a pluralistic people or society, and I think India's strength lies in its diversity. You can try and Hinduize it as much as you like. And let me go back to that 2014 election that I mentioned. I talked about development and the economy or whatever. But let's face it, that election was won on Hindutva. But I think Hindutva is losing its shine, as is Modi ji. I think he's a little bit more vulnerable today than he was last year or the year before. And I think in due course, he will discover, like Shakespeare's heroes, that, the idea of all the world's a stage can be depressing at times. And so I think there's no way that this India can move forward if mentally you've got this idea that you can forget about 15 or 16% of your population. That is India. And you go to the Punjab and try and convince people there. I think we are forgetting that we are
15% is the proportion of Muslims in the population plus Christians, which is about 2%.
Yeah.
For the national population. Just to make it clear.
I think we also have to admit that we are a pretty parochial people. There's nothing wrong with that. But you go to the Punjab and try and sell the idea that every Sikh is a Hindu, and the swords will be out because Sikhs will not admit it. So what are we talking about? It's just not on this whole thing. Now, I don't think Modi ji understands this.
He started out as a pracharak of the RSS, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. So did Vajpayee, but
No, he was a Swayam Sevak, a volunteer.
Whatever he was, but he wore the same colored shorts. And yet look at the transformation, from where to where to where. I would think that Vajpayee has been the smartest politician that India has produced. The ultimate Chanakya.
Ninan, on this question, please.
Ram, I'm glad you brought in the Constitution because it is a challenge to the Constitution, this alternative view of the idea of India. But if I were to move away from this kind of discussion to suggest that if you take the long view, one could argue that as the BJP gains experience of government, it is actually moving away from its core positions. It may not officially de jure move away from them, but de facto it is moving away from them. The emphasis on Article 370 has given way to a coalition government with the PDP. There is no Ram temple. So on a lot of
but
issues...
they're preparing. Reports say
the temple exists, but
they're
not
doing
in the way that
something,
they want to
bricks
build
and all
it.
that.
I'm sorry?
Bricks are being assembled.
Yeah, I mean, there are fringe elements. All I'm saying is that if you look at the movement of where they started from and where they are today, there is, I think, the progressive acquisition, if you will, of the characteristics of a party of government. It's not complete. It's a very partial process so far. But the whole thesis that in a broadly two-party or two-coalition system, the tendency is to move towards the center because you need to be more acceptable to more and more people, is really what is happening today. That it is moving away from the fringe positions towards the center, and the process will go on for a long time, in my view. It's nowhere near complete.
Now that raises the obvious, before you come in, the obvious political question, the interesting question. If you do that, will they lose more shine? It's clear they're already losing some shine. They've lost some shine. See what happened in Delhi, Bihar, with the Gujarat local elections and so on. But if they move to the center, obscuring some of these very unpleasant to most people features, do you think they'll lose out in their core constituency?
Well, if you look at the statistics, they won the 2014 election with 31% of the vote. Now, no party in our history has won a majority, single-party majority, with such a low percentage of the vote. So this is a very abnormal election created by very special circumstances because the opposition is completely splintered. It is almost certain that that 31% will come down in the next election because it's very difficult to hold to that high level when belief and expectations in Mr. Modi were sky high. So if they say that, and the normal vote percentage is 25% or less, so it fluctuates between 18 and 25%. So if you assume that 31% is going to come down, they have to lose a majority. How are they going to rule? It has to be a coalition. How do you form a coalition? You have to move to the center.
You really suggest, we are really speculating on the possibility, perhaps even the likelihood of regional parties banding together to form the next government.
It's
looking at it.
It's happened before.
That's
it can
the
happen
trend.
again.
That is a tendency now. Okay, Shashi.
Well, that's slightly dimmer, and I think this is a discussion on which really none of us has the last word because these analyses are out there. But we already saw with Mr. Vajpayee that move to the center that Ninan talked about. And what we've seen with Mr. Modi's government and his party under his leadership has been a move away from the center towards the right. We've had members of the Council of Ministers making the most intemperate statements. The Ramzadeh versus, I can't mention the unprintable word, a statement was by a Minister of State in the government. The statement by a leading BJP figure that those who don't like Mr. Modi should go to Pakistan was by a Minister of State in the government. The President of the ruling party says that if Mr. Modi loses in Bihar, firecrackers will go off in Pakistan. I mean, first of all, if your idea is that those who criticize the government should be as far away from you as possible, why not suggest Canada? I mean, why Pakistan? It's next door. Because there is a signal, and the signal is one of, frankly, minority bigotry. It's a signal that's very deliberately sought to be conveyed. On top of that, you've got a person senior enough in the BJP to be a chairman of a parliamentary committee and often asked to lead the BJP in debates in the Lok Sabha, saying that instead of commemorating Mahatma Gandhi, we should have statues of Natarajan Godse throughout the country. Yes, now, none of these people are repudiated. We can't dismiss them as fringe, Ninan, because then they shouldn't be in the Council of Ministers and they shouldn't be chairmen of committees. They can't be fringe. They are amongst the top elements of what the BJP is all about. So I have actually discerned the opposite of the trend you've identified. I feel that the BJP has moved away from the Vajpayee center and that Mr. Modi, through his silence, has condoned this. Now, you may be right that after the next election, the best they can hope for is going back to coalition governance where they will have to once again make allowances. But in the meantime, we're seeing a systematic pursuit of the politics of polarization. We're seeing it in Bihar. We've seen it. Every time there's a by-election somewhere, there'll be a communal incident because the BJP still seems to believe that they will win on the basis of Hindutva votes. And that clearly has been belied by the election results, and one hopes they will learn a lesson from it.
Just one little word here. Yeah. Just one little word here. On this centrism and the BJP shifting, I think that's one thing I welcome. because at least we are clear where it stands or what it stands for. Because what was happening in the last 20 years or so, I think it goes back to Mrs. Gandhi's time, that both the Congress and the BJP were far too close. They were within kissing distance of each other.
Sorry, when was this? Which election? In which period?
Vajpayee's time, let's say, okay. I would say ever since 1980 or so. And now that the BJP is clearly moved to the right, I hope the Congress will also shift slightly to the left. Look at what has happened in Britain. You have a Labour leader there who has rejected the idea of Blair's New Labour, and he's taking Labour back to its proper moorings. So you have a proper leftist party in Britain now. And that guy, again, I feel, is going to be a player in the next election, whether the Brits accept that or not. So this too much closeness in politics means that nobody stands for nothing.
This is an extremely interesting point, that you need clear differentiation.
I want to
ideological and political.
Ram, I want to throw a totally different idea into this. I know you're finishing it up.
No, just before you'll have your time. You didn't see that there was this sign saying 20 minutes, 5 minutes ago. And we have promised that there'll be a full 10 minutes for questions and criticisms. So we'll have to be extremely disciplined at this point, because we have to address one other question on security very quickly, or maybe in the question.
Very quick. No, I just wanted to say that India can't, pluralistic nature of the idea of India can never be removed by anybody. And the outside idea that I wanted to throw in is sometimes, I mean, I'm equally outraged by the statements, just like Shashi said. After all, you know, we come from a similar strand of thinking. But sometimes the optics distracts from the fundamentals, and then you don't concentrate on why the jobs are not being generated, why is there violence against women, why, you know, the absolutely vital issues, because we're talking about, you know, instead of ignoring outrageous statements. That was the outside idea I wanted to bring in.
Thank you. Finally, Mr. Dulat, the problem of terrorism, very quickly, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, the problem of terrorism, sir, all I would say is terrorism is not going to go away, neither in India nor in the rest of the world. I think we've been quite fortunate that since Mumbai, leave aside Pathankot, and I think we had a warning for Pathankot when Dinanagar or Gurdaspur happened, and we didn't seem to heed that warning because we knew where it was coming from, and we even knew the route it came through. But we didn't, nobody woke up to it or didn't take it very seriously. We tend to be a little laid back when it comes to security. We are very good in times of crisis, but otherwise there is a little relaxed kind of feeling. But the connected point I was coming to, and that was Pakistan. And now that Modi ji has been to Lahore, he's, as they say, doed the deed, I think he must remain stuck in, you know, because I think engagement with Pakistan is important and it must carry on. Today, I was...
You're a very unusual security...
I am, sir. That's why I wrote that book, incidentally. But today, I was reading our former Home Minister. There's a remark by him saying, we should engage with Pakistan but not talk Kashmir. Now, I beg to differ with him. Why should we not talk Kashmir? I think Kashmir is at the center of this whole thing. And why do we shy away from Kashmir? And let me also say here that the status quo in Kashmir does not suit us. We must understand this. It's not to our advantage. Because when you have a good thing going, it must be carried forward. And in fact, today the status quo is helping Pakistan. And that is why 2015 has been a bad year. So I would say focus on Kashmir. We should be prepared to discuss Kashmir and keep yourself engaged with Pakistan. And we must move forward there. I think Modi ji has an opportunity.
Thank you. Shashi, on terrorism.
Yeah, actually, I agree that we should stay engaged. In fact, I would go one step further and suggest that we should actually unilaterally open up certain things to Pakistan. We've done it on the trade, though the Pakistanis argue that our non-tariff barriers are sort of tend to outweigh the benefit of most favored nation status. But I think we should be much more liberal on visas. I think saying that that will enhance the risks of terrorism is absurd, because none of the killers of 2611 or of Pathankot applied for visas. They have ways of getting into our country without them, whereas visas, it seems to me, would enhance the numbers of people who could come to this country. I've rarely met a Pakistani who has been to India and not gone away enchanted and positively disposed. I think we should open up trade, including with those many military-owned companies in Pakistan. Let the captains and the generals develop a stake. What I want is to enlarge the space in Pakistan, in civil society and in the military, of people who have a stake in good relations with India, in order to reduce the options for military adventure by those elements in the army and in the terrorist establishment that actually wish to conduct these things against us. We've tried everything else, let's try this now.
Since we are talking about relations with neighboring countries, here, you brought it up. I think I'm very unhappy about what has been done onto Nepal.
That's really surprising, because, you know, Nepal is like, they almost acknowledge that they are India. They always call you Bada Bhai. I spent 4 years in Nepal, and, you know, they always looked up to you. And whenever anything needed to be done, they would say, Aap kara dijiye na. You were talking about roads in Kerala, sir. When I was in Nepal in the mid-70s, there were hardly any roads there. And every time you mentioned to a minister that I think your road needs repair, he would say, Aap kara dijiye. Because they're so used to, you know, getting help from India.
Dulat sahab, when you mentioned Bada Bhai, don't forget the episode in 71, the build-up to the war with Pakistan, when the Pakistani foreign minister went to Kathmandu and was hailed as a friend, and a journalist asked the Nepalese foreign minister, but you've just said a month ago or a week ago, whatever, that India is your brother. So he said, yes, India is our brother. Pakistan is our friend. Pause. You can choose your friends. So let us not get too carried away with sentimentality.
No. Let me tell you another one like that. And this used to be in, I'm going back to King Birendra's time, that whenever he visited Delhi, the Nepalese on the road would say, Mami ne bulaya hai. So that also...
Translate for largely non-Hindi.
I beg your pardon. Yeah, that Mami, he's been called by Mami, and that's why he's going to Delhi.
I was referring to what most people in Nepal believe is a blockade imposed by India. Foolishly now, that's what they think.
Yeah, I've actually raised this in my capacity as chairman of the Standing Committee and also as a member of the Consultative Committee. The government assures us that this is not their intention. There is obviously room for some dispute. What has happened essentially is that 65% of our goods go through one particular crossing point, Birganj Raksal. That's where on the other side of the border, the Madhesis are conducting demonstrations. They've even burned a truck that has tried to go across. And so what our government is saying is that we're trying to divert more and more traffic to the other crossing points, which are relatively open, and goods are getting in. But the principal crossing point is still obstructed on the Nepalese side, and so India should not be blamed. The Nepalese counter-answer is that these fellows could not continue their obstruction without some implicit or explicit support from India, and then it becomes a question of trading accusations and counter-accusations. But I can assure you that within the political establishment and parliament, we definitely don't want to see Indians asking a few years from now who lost Nepal. You know, we really feel this is a vital relationship that has to be preserved, and we are putting pressure on the government from within the political process to ease up on and to do everything in their power to ensure this relationship doesn't worsen.
Thank you, that's very useful. Now, questions, please.
It is said that, you know, we get politicians we deserve and not whom we desire. When we are talking a lot of these things, I believe the root cause is a kind of member of parliaments who represent us. So do you feel, and I don't want you to take any political stand representing your party, but overall at the Indian level, because you are the people so close to the powers, whether while you are in power or in opposition.
Please don't elaborate.
Do we, sure.
Yeah.
So do you see any perceptible dialogues happening about bringing down the quality of our members of parliament? And if so, in what direction is it progressing?
Do you want to go first or shall I? I mean, Jayanthi has far more experience in the political world than I have. But having come in the hard way, that is, having had to contest the Lok Sabha twice and win the right to represent the people of a constituency, I can tell you that it's not easy. And my respect for the political class has gone up immeasurably since I joined it, not because I'm a member of it, but because I see how hard they work, which the general public rarely sees. Politics at its best in our country is really an extension of social work by other means. A lot of what you're dealing with every day are the problems of individual constituents. And that's something which, I mean, Jayanthi was in the upper house, she can give a different perspective. From the Lok Sabha perspective, this is extremely important. Now, who gets elected? Obviously, that depends very much on the electorate. And it seems to me that if you want to see a different kind of political representative, you will also want to see a change in the electorate. As the electorate gets more educated, more middle class, it will have different yardsticks in what it expects from its politicians. You will see different voting patterns. In many parts of northern India, it's still true that if you cast your vote, you're voting your caste. Right, I mean, that's basically what happens in many parts of the country. And there you may not get the kind of politicians you desire. Desire seemed a slightly inappropriate word. Let me say that maybe what you want is the kind of politicians you can be proud of. And I would agree that there are many in our system who perhaps don't attract that kind of admiration that you wish to be able to have for your political representatives. That requires a lot of qualities, but ultimately, in a democracy, electability is going to be the determining factor. And you may have some wonderful people you'd like to see in office, but if they are not, they may be able, but they may not be electable. And if they're not electable, they're not going to get a chance to represent you.
Jayanthi, very quickly.
No, my very quick answer is I disagree with Shashi because far more difficult to get elected to the upper house. Try getting MLAs to vote for you. I mean, people are so much...
Party whip is the answer, Jayanthi.
Only observed in the breach. Otherwise, I agree with what Shashi said.
Hello. Yeah. My question is to Dr. Tharoor.
No, before that.
Actually,
Tharoor,
sir,
please.
There's a lady with a mic.
yeah. Mr. Tharoor actually partially answered the question I wanted to raise because what I was finding actually lacking from the whole discourse, the solutions to making India work to me looked like it was a very top-down, state-owned approach to how to solve the problems of India. What was lacking is a complete, a discussion on the role of civil society. As someone who works in public health, I see that there's a complete paralysis of the rights-based approach, participatory approach in formulating policies and bottom-up. So how do we inculcate? Because you talked about an educated electorate, but that cannot happen unless we start at the grassroots with the town hall sort of discourses, things that we see in other countries. So I think that's a very, very crucial part of making India work, which I think that panelists need to sort of address. So anyway.
I agree. And I think that very frankly, we shouldn't have an approach to democracy under which people seem to feel the need for accountability only once every 5 years. To my mind, it's an ongoing process. I became the first MP in our history to give an annual report to my voters on what I had done during the year, how I had spent the taxpayers' money, what are the initiatives I'd undertaken. That's now catching on a bit. There are other MPs doing this. But the fact is that in Kerala, I have a very demanding and indeed an educated electorate. Other parts of the country, it may not be the same. We need to encourage much more of this through the country.
I think that Nalini raised a very... I attempted to say that by saying all hands on deck. Ram is a very strict taskmaster. I think civil society is the incredibly important link between government and the people, who speak for the people, who identify the areas where things are lacking, who create the voice for the people. And I think without civil society, we'd be in a very difficult place.
Now, speaking about NGOs, under the present dispensation, there seems to be a lot of problems for a certain category of NGOs to do what they've been doing, and for others to do much more than what they've been doing. There seems to be a clear shift in the attitude towards NGOs as a part of civil society.
Well, I think that it's very important to ensure that NGOs are judged by the work. That the very essence of NGOs is lack of governmental control. They're supposed to speak, and they're supposed to voice what governments are not necessarily happy to hear. So any clamping down unreasonably on NGOs, I heard. I don't know, even now, I think animal activists are being called foreign agents at the moment. So I think we should be very careful of a trend in this direction.
Just to add to that, actually,
No, you will get a chance.
yeah, just,
I don't know if we can take 5 more minutes. No? It's a wrap. She says
it's a wrap.
Dr. Tharoor and Jayanthi, this caste system of voting, is it not a narrative of all the assembly and Lok Sabha segments in the entire India in the history of voting in the last 70 years? I feel the right person is not able to get elected because now, Mr. Tharoor, can you win an election in Malappuram? And your colleague Ahmed in Trivandrum, where there is the most majority. I long for a day when you will stand in Malappuram and get elected.
Well, if I had the endorsement of the Muslim League, I might well get elected, but they are the strongest party in Malappuram. It's very...
Again, you answered my question. It's a Muslim league.
No,
in Trivandrum, it will be a Hindu.
No, the thing is that, yes, but again, for example, in Trivandrum, of the 3 principal parties, 2 had Nair candidates. So caste alone could not have been a determining factor because the... No, in my case, because I was running for re-election, I actually had concrete achievements to point to. And those who benefited tangibly from my work voted for me. So the parts where I outstripped my rival were entirely places where I actually had specific projects that had transformed lives, and that converted itself into votes. Increasingly, I believe the politics of performance will supplant the politics of identity. We've seen this in Bihar. Mr. Lalu Prasad Yadav won 2 elections essentially on the slogan of, isn't it time that people like us were in power? The 3rd time, people started saying, where is our Bijli Sadak Pani? And even that's a progress because 20 years earlier, it had been Roti Kapda Makan. Now we've moved on to Bijli Sadak Pani. And tomorrow it might be the internet. Hamare 4G kahan hai? So the country is demanding more, voters are demanding more, they will demand more, and we will move away from identity. It'll take time.
We have absolutely run out of time, and out of courtesy to the next session, I think we must stop here. Thank you very much. No. We'd love to have that taken on board, but it's just not possible here. Thank you very much, and it's best that this is left inconclusive.